All right, I think maybe we can start then. Welcome everyone. This is an event in the Philosophy and Medicine Colloquium series, which is being run by the Selby Philosophy and Medicine Project at King's College London, and which is funded by the Selby Foundation. So I'm very pleased to welcome Anneli Jefferson here today. She is a lecturer in philosophy at the University of Cardiff. She's also a visiting researcher at King's College and a friend of the Selby Project. Her research interests are in psychology, moral philosophy, also in philosophy of psychiatry and those intersections. And today she's going to give a talk entitled Externalism and the Limits of Biological Psychiatry. So very nice to have you here, Anneli, and over to you.
Thank you very much. So I hope you can all hear me. If not, then somebody frantically wave or something. So I'm very pleased to be here and honored to have so many people listening to what I've got to say. So what I'm going to be talking about is some work in progress, which is part of a book project that I'll talk about a bit more in a minute. And I'd be very pleased to hear what you guys have got to say about my thoughts on externalism and how it affects biological psychiatry, and in particular, the claim that mental disorders are brain disorders. And without further ado, one more thing before I get going. So I'm very aware that I've got an interdisciplinary audience here, and that some of you will have a more medical background and some of you will have a philosophical background. So I'm trying to keep the jargon as reduced as possible, but I will break in the middle very briefly to see whether there's any understanding questions. Also, because of this format, I cannot see all of you, and if you're all looking at me in a what on earth is she going on about way, I won't be able to tell. So I'll break in the middle, but it's just for clarification questions and not the philosophy clarification questions where you're packing an objection into a clarification question. And then if there aren't any, we'll just carry on till the end, and then any discussion about the merits of the argument we can then do at the end in the discussion period. Okay, so let's go. Now, why is this not, okay, here we go. I need to do something with my screen, otherwise I won't be able to see it properly. Okay, so let's start off with two quotes to set the scene. Addiction is a condition that changes the way the brain works, just like diabetes changes the way the pancreas works. Then why shouldn't it be viewed as a disease? That's Lewis, 2017, presenting the brain disorder view that he disagrees with. And then we have Will Davies in a 2016 paper saying, as a general thesis about the nature of mental disorder, however, biomedical materialism must fail. Mental disorders are profoundly different from somatic illnesses in at least one respect. Many mental illnesses satisfy the externalist schema, whereas somatic illnesses do not. So here we have the claim that what we've got in mental disorders, at least in many mental disorders, is something completely different from what we've got in somatic and physical disorders. And let's have a look whether that's actually the case. I will talk you through the plan quickly, and then we'll get into the content. So first of all, I'm going to present the problem a bit more than I just have. Then I will give you a naive internalist or individualist view of addiction as a brain disorder. Then I will talk about why and how mental disorders, including addiction disorder, depend on factors outside the brain. Then I'll quickly break to see whether there's any questions on things I've said that weren't clear. And then I'll dig into the externalist challenge to the view that mental disorders are brain disorders. And then I'll say that actually for that view, externalism isn't the main problem. And I'll do that using the example of depression. And then I'll discuss some ways you could have an externalist view of addiction as a brain disorder, but I should already qualify that that's a view of brain disorder that's quite different from some paradigmatic brain disorders like brain tumors or Alzheimer's disease. Okay, so how did we get here and where are we going? So whether some mental disorders or brain disorders is a contested issue. It's also, more importantly, and I think that's what underlies a lot of that debate, a contested issue, what that even means to say that mental disorders are brain disorders. And that's what I'm working on more generally. And as I was working on that, I came across these externalist claims, which seem to blow the idea that mental disorders can be brain disorders out of the water completely. So I thought, well, I'd better look at that. So I'll give you one externalist claim to begin with. And that's that facts external to the agent's brain decide whether an agent is disordered or ill. And therefore mental disorders can't be brain disorders. And what I want to do in this talk is agree with the premise, but disagree that the conclusion follows. Okay, quick thing on what externalism is. Well, externalism, as if your philosophers will know, is something that we have in different areas of philosophy, and it means different things in different areas in philosophy. I'm interested in externalism in the philosophy of mind, but even there we have quite a few different externalisms. And a lot of those won't interest me today. So let's just go through some of the externalisms we have and then sort of zone in on what I'm interested in. So content externalism, well, that's like, if you want, our old-fashioned externalism is roughly that the meaning of terms or concepts depends on the link to the substance they're normally used to refer to. So that would be Putnam's twin earth example, where water would refer to different things in different environments on twin earth and on earth. Or it might depend on the way others, for example, experts use the term, that would be bird. But recently we've also had the extended mind hypothesis, which says that mental states and processes are not just in the brain, they are embodied, extended, embedded, and enacted. Now I could spend a whole lecture on what that boils down to, but it's actually easier if we look at certain examples later on and see what's externalist there. Because in a recent paper from last year, Roberts et al. Talked about externalism in psychiatry in the context of autism, and they found 6 different kinds of externalism which were relevant to psychiatry. So let's just have a general formulation and then some more specific examples. The general formulation is that the status of a condition as a disorder depends on factors external to the individual in its brain. So it also depends on its factors, also obviously depends on internal factors. And a mental health condition sometimes requires external factors for its constitution. And I'll give you one example from Will Davis's paper. He talks about oppositional defiant disorder. And he says, well, that's characterized by a certain way people interact, young people interact with authorities and react against authorities. And in order to even have that kind of disease or disorder condition, you have to have a certain kind of environment that's structured in an authoritarian way. Otherwise, you couldn't have the disorder. So there you even need sort of the context and the relation between the individual and social environment to constitute the kind of disorder. Okay, now I'm going to give you a picture of relatively naive individualism or naive internalism. I don't want to say that internalism is a naive theory, that's just another word for individualism. So here is the neural sufficiency thesis, which says that neural activity is sufficient to characterize a brain process and the corresponding mental process as dysfunctional. I've adapted that in a way from Mark Spivak's paper from 2011. Now I want to, before I continue, give a caveat, because it's actually never sufficient to just look, if you like, inside the brain. So why am I saying that? Well, the idea of dysfunction in and of itself has the idea of comparison built into it. So we identify dysfunction by comparing it to what we think of as normal functioning, and that could be comparing to the way a person or an organism or an organ or a psychological process was earlier. But it could also be by comparing it to a group. If you think of Bors's biostatistical account, where you say, well, dysfunction arises when we compare to what's normal in a population or in a reference group. So taking that into account, that there's always some comparative some comparative element, we can still say that in the individualistic tradition, if you like, the idea is that if we look at the brain, then that's enough to decide that the individual is ill. Once we've decided that that kind of process is dysfunctional, we could sort of just go and look at the brain and see, right, that's it, they're ill. Okay, and now I'm going to give you an example of naive individualism, which I've reconstructed from Lewis, who wrote a paper about whether addiction is a brain disease, and he says it isn't. And I'm just going to take one argument from Lewis, and Lewis is not interested in externalism in his paper, it should be said. But he does say quite a few things which I think give us a good way of illustrating what individualists or internalists would be after. Okay, so here's what Lewis says about addiction. He says, with regard to romantic pairing, Burkett and Young conclude that when these early interactions with the objects of addiction produce rewarding outcomes, dopamine is released in the nucleus accumbens, which acts to increase the salience of incentive cues that predict the reward. If addiction is a disease, then so apparently is love. So what Lewis is saying is that we get, if you like, dysregulated, if you want to use that language, dopamine activity both in addiction and in romantic love, and therefore addiction can't be a disorder. So what the individualist would say is brain activity should be sufficient to mark a condition as a brain disease once we've individuated what we take to be dysfunctional brain activity. If we find that kind of activity in non-disordered people, we are not dealing with a brain disease after all. And I've put that for you in a nice little argument. So here's an individualist argument. So any condition involving disordered brain function is a disorder. Addiction involves disordered brain function, therefore addiction is a disorder. So far, so good. Looks reasonably straightforward. And then we get another finding, which is that brain activity found in addiction can also be found in conditions such as being in love. And being in love is not generally considered a disorder. Therefore, we're either going to have to say that the brain function in addiction is not disordered, and therefore addiction is not a brain disorder after all, through modus tollens, and that is the way that Lewis goes. Or we're going to have to say that being in love is a brain disorder. Now, you might be tempted sometimes, you know, when somebody's calling their ex at 2 a.m. in the morning and they know they're going to regret it the next day. It's not in their long-term interest, but that's just what they feel the intense urge to do. It can sometimes look quite similar to disordered wanting and thinking, but that's not the conclusion we normally draw. So we normally, or at least Lewis does the modus tollens. So now, what's that got to do with individualism? Because I just gave you an anti-brain disorder argument, and that might be feel a bit roundabout and be a bit confusing. But let me just explain a bit more. So the idea is that if we accept this argument by Lewis, we give up on the idea that addiction is a brain disorder. But the reason we are giving up on that idea is because we're still wedded to the individualist way of thinking about brain disorders. Because the idea is that if there were a unique pattern of activity or structural change in the brain that is found only in that condition, we would be dealing with a brain disorder. And now, as another step in the argument, if we also think that addiction is only a disorder, if it is a brain disorder, and that's what Lewis suggests, then showing that addiction isn't a brain disorder also shows that it isn't a disorder in the first place. Now that was the internalist view of disorders, that you think, well, once if what we want and what we didn't get in the addiction case is a brain signature, that's gonna give us the stamp as disordered. Now here's the externalist counter view on mental disorders with an example of depression. And I'm taking this from Will Davies's paper on externalism and psychiatry. So depression in the DSM-5 focuses on depressed mood, anhedonia, weight loss or gain, depending on how things go, insomnia or hypersomnia, and a few other things. But Davies, and he's not the only one, he draws on Wakefield in this, points out that depression is only disorder if problems with mood are not an appropriate response to the individual's situation and environment. So he says that even if it is qualitatively identical, grief for the loss of a loved one would be an expectable and proportionate reaction and therefore not disordered, but it might feel just the same inside. So the internal states are not enough to make a person disordered. And I'll give you a quote for that. So he says, depression crucially involves states that are unwarranted by or disproportionate to events in the subject's life. Aristotle thus characterized melancholia as a sadness that is cold beyond due measure, producing a groundless despondency. Now, one thing I would like to say in defense of the DSM is that it's not, or at least not always, quite as internalist or just focused on the internal states of the individual as Davies suggests. So even in the example of depression, you have one of the criteria being excessive feelings of guilt and inappropriate feeling of guilt. And once again, you have exactly the same idea of proportionality in that you think, well, there's sort of an appropriate reaction to certain things that happen to you, and then there's one that's out of proportion. Obviously, that idea of proportionality raises new problems as to which are, when do we decide when something is proportional, but I'll just shelve that for now. Okay, so that's the externalist view of depression as a disorder, and let's have another look at addiction, because we also have externalist views of addiction as a disorder. And one thing I should have said earlier, and I forgot, so I'm going to say it now because it's an easy thing to get hung up on, is that this is in many ways a very armchair talk. So when I say the brain states in addiction, brain states in love are the same kind, there's the same kind of dopamine difference and so on and so forth. I'm just taking one of the claims that Lewis makes in his paper, and even for him that's oversimplified, that's one of his arguments, and taking that as read. So I'm not claiming that this is the truth about the neuroscience of addiction. I'm just saying if that were the truth, what would follow? And that's what I'm interested in. Okay, so now how can we have an externalist view of addiction as a disorder? Well, it turns out there's various and assorted different ones. One is from Wakefield, who directly reacts to what Lewis wrote, and he says the following: Lewis implicitly appeals to the biologically designed context of a normal range love object to secure the normality of the lover's brain state, then ignores the context of the addict's brain state in moving from the normality of the lover to the normality of the addict. However, loving a drug's high is not within the biologically designed range of triggers for love-like brain states. So Wakefield's idea is that whether we're talking about addiction or about love, we need to have basically a picture that is externalist in that it looks at what the individual is reacting to. And if it's okay to look at what the person who's in love is reacting to, then we should also be looking at what the addict is reacting to. And then he also says, well, as it happens, loving a drug's high is not within the biologically designed range of triggers for love-like brain states. Let's just keep that standing there and not worry about whether how we decide what the biologically designed range of triggers for those kinds of states are. Okay, and then Neil Levy also has an externalist view of addiction as a disorder, not as a brain disorder, which will be very important later. And he says that addiction is only disorder in environments where it causes impairment. And he says addiction only sometimes causes impairment, so addiction is only sometimes it's disorder. And when it's a disorder, it's a mental disorder. Okay, so I think I am now exactly halfway through. I've given you the internalism. I've given you the externalist view, and I'm just going to very briefly break to see whether anybody's terribly confused. And if not, then I'll carry on to look at what exactly the externalist challenge is and how we can meet it. So I can only see my slides at the moment, but if somebody wants to ask an urgent question, then please go for it.
I'm not seeing any questions, so.
Okay, well then let's charge on. Okay. So we've seen that the externalists have a view of what makes something a disorder, and that a mental disorder, and that the environment is quite important in that. And sometimes that's reactions to the environment, most of the time. So why would that be a problem for somebody who wants to say that a mental disorder is a brain disorder? Well, the first thing to say is that looking at the brain is not enough to establish that a person has a specific mental or brain disorder. You don't know whether it's depression until you know whether it's an inappropriate reaction. That's what Davis told us, which means that the sufficiency thesis fails. So let me remind you of what the sufficiency thesis was. Neural activity is sufficient to characterize a brain process and the corresponding mental process as dysfunctional. So that doesn't seem to be true anymore, because it needed to be the relationship between the organism and its environment that also played a role here, and whether the states were appropriate. And then we get the claim that because of this, mental disorders are fundamentally different from somatic disorders because of the way they rely on the interaction between the agent's mental states and the environment. And what I'm going to at least try to show and try to convince you of is that the problem for the brain disorder claim is not actually externalism when there's a problem. The problem is that we often can't find a systematic brain difference. And I'll explain that in more detail as we go on. Okay, so first of all, let's try to dig a bit deeper and get to the bottom of the disanalogy that Will Davis says there is between mental illnesses and somatic illnesses. So why does he think that externalism shows that there's a fundamental difference between those two kinds of illness? So we said that depression is only a disorder because it involves inappropriate grief. And that means that external factors matter in showing that X, in this case depression, is dysfunctional. And then we get the comparison that we always get, which is to brain cancer. Actually, it's not the comparison we always get. Sometimes we get the comparison to Alzheimer's or Parkinson's. And the idea is that cancer involves a physical dysfunction, and that's a dysfunction whatever else is going on in the world around the individual. If you have that kind of humor, like on that picture, in your brain, that's going to destroy your brain, irrespective of what's going on outside you. Okay. Now, my question is the problem here really externalism? And I want to approach that with a thought experiment. It's not one of your most outlandish thought experiments, I can reassure you, but let's just have a quick look. So what if we could show that the inappropriate emotional reactions, or the out of sync emotional reactions that we experience in depression, are indeed always explainable by a serotonin deficiency? So I know that the serotonin imbalance hypothesis for depression is extremely contested, so that's why we've got to bear with me in the slide. So let's just assume that's the case. Let's just say we found something wrong or different in the serotonin system, where people have depression, and whenever that difference in the brain occurs, somebody will also show the symptoms of depression and overreact or underreact and to certain external stimuli. Now, would that be so different from some other cases in somatic illnesses? So here's my example. I'm not sure how good an example it is. I looked for some other examples. Shane Blacken has written a paper with a lot of examples where he says somatic illness is quite similar, and it's also in some ways externalist, and therefore mental disorders don't have this special statement. And here's a way of thinking of hemophilia as externalist. So the idea is that whether blood should clot or not depends on the context, once again. When it's inside your body, it shouldn't clot, otherwise you will get a stroke. When it's outside your body, it should clot, otherwise it won't stop flowing. So that's not Glacken's example, but I found that one easier to get my head around. So the idea is here too, the context depends, what something does in different contexts determines whether something counts as disordered. And in both cases, the depression case and the hemophilia case, there's some kind of normative notion of how the mind or the body, in the case of hemophilia, should react under certain circumstances. And that normative condition specifies a condition as in hemophilia or depression as pathological. So if it weren't the case that in certain contexts your blood did certain things or you reacted certain ways, then you wouldn't be suffering from a disorder. Nevertheless, there's also a physiological difference that underlies those kinds of reactions, at least in our thought experiment. I realize that in real life, that's not quite so straightforward for depression. So what that leads me to think is that the real problem isn't actually externalism. Rather, that what is driving the intuition that mental disorders are different or fundamentally different from somatic disorders in the depression case is that the brain isn't doing any work. It's not externalism. Now, there's two responses, one which is on the slide, so I'll go through that first, and then the other one which has just occurred to me, and it's sort of in the discussion where I want to make it explicit. So here's the first response. It can't be the brain that matters for mental illnesses, because if we had the brain signature, the serotonin deficiency or imbalance, without the psychological problems, we wouldn't be dealing with the disorder. That's an argument we get in Hannah Picard 2011. Now, I would agree with that, but the assumption that I'm making for the sake of the argument is that you could have a mental disorder where you find a reliable brain basis that is sufficient for the psychological symptoms. Now, another objection you might have is that it's a bit tricky comparing mental disorders and somatic disorders generally, because both mental disorders and somatic disorders come in more or less externalist. So probably your most externalist somatic disorder is an allergy, where it depends an awful lot on the context whether you've got a problem or not. If you're allergic against a substance that doesn't exist in the country you're living in, you might never know you've got an allergy, and it's at least questionable whether you've got a disorder. If you look once again at brain cancer, that looks a lot more internalist. So both in the somatic realm and in the realm of mental disorder, we have quite a range of conditions, let me say. And it's probably always more useful to compare specific conditions rather than making sweeping statements about the fundamental difference between one kind of health condition, mental, and the other kind of health condition, physical. Okay, so now let's have another look at addiction and what we can say about addiction. Because addiction is, as I say in my slide, it's odd because we do have changes in the brain and they are reliably associated with psychological changes, at least the way we're reading the literature at the moment. But we also have these similar physiological and psychological changes when we fall in love. So it seems that here we cannot rely on the brain differences in isolation to establish that somebody is suffering from addiction rather than being in love. And we can also, if you were just looking at the brain, this is probably not true, strictly speaking, because I can't imagine that it's exactly the same. But let's just say there's a great similarity in what happens in the dopamine system in the brain when when you see your loved object or react to a trigger of what the substance you're addicted to. So you don't have neural sufficiency. So what can you say about addiction? Well, one thing you could say, as Lewis does, is that addiction isn't a disorder at all. Another thing that you could say is that addiction is a mental disorder, but not a brain disorder. And then a third thing is you could say is that addiction is sometimes a mental disorder and it involves brain dysfunction, but it is never a brain disorder. Or you could say that addiction is a brain disorder. And I am interested in the last two options because I'm interested in whether you can defend the brain disorder claim even for addiction, if you want to say it's a disorder in the first place, which you may not want to say, but let's say you do want to say that bit. So here's the option of having addiction as a brain disorder. And we already saw that earlier with Wakefield. And Wakefield's suggestion is that the brain is reacting to specific substances it is not evolutionarily designed to react to in the way it reacts. So he says it is not the narrow choice functioning or the brain states underlying it per se, but the context in which they occur, and specifically whether the narrow choice functioning is of a kind that we understand as being biologically designed to occur in that specific kind of context that determines the judgment of normality versus disorder. So Wakefield is perfectly happy to say that addiction is a brain disorder, even buying into the claim that there's similar stuff going on in the brain as there would be in being in love. And he says, well, that's because we need to take into account what the organism is reacting to. Now, obviously, that gives you that puts you into the position where you have to, if you want to do this in terms of evolutionary function, say what substances the organism is evolutionary designed to react to in what ways, and that's a pretty big ask. So I'm not saying that Wakefield's position necessarily works, but it's clear how he sees things as hanging together. He says, well, the brain's supposed to react in that way to that, in that way to that, and if it doesn't do that, then there's something wrong with it. And here's another option. You could tie this function not to evolutionary function, but to ways of processing and thinking and deciding that cause impairment for the individual. And that's to an extent how Levi does the whole thing. So he says psychological impairment, so for example, impairment in rational decision-making, is sufficient to show that addiction is a mental disorder when the agent is adversely affected. So if there's a problem in the way the agent decides and wants and so on and so forth, and if that's harming them, then we're going to say that he's disordered. But he says that isn't always the case. Addiction isn't always a disorder. And he uses a number of examples to show that. So he says, well, the dry alcoholic might still have cravings, but in his rational decision making is not impaired, and he can live a normal life in many ways. And then he says, well, even if we are addicted, and our brain is doing all the addicted kind of things, and our psychology is doing all the addicted kind of things, that might not be a problem. So let's say I'm a caffeine addict, as possibly many here are. I can be a caffeine addict without any problems in my life, as long as I don't run out of coffee. I can have my coffee twice a day, and it can be a strong double shot or something, and that doesn't cause any impairment. And Levy thinks that the fact that whether there's an impairment and the fact that that doesn't always occur and that it depends on context shows that even when addiction is a disorder, because it does cause an impairment, it's not a brain disorder. So I was very puzzled about this when I first read that. So why would he say that addiction is sometimes a disorder? And he also says that it involves dysfunctional brain processes and talks through the literature on changes in the dopamine system and so on and so forth. So he says it involves brain dysfunction. It's sometimes a disorder, but it's not a brain disorder when it's a disorder. It's only a mental disorder. And here we kind of get that idea again that we had before, where he says that brain disorders impair the agents across all contexts, not just in one context. If you've got a brain disorder, you've always got a problem. And he justifies that by appealing to a paradigm case of brain disorders, in this case, Alzheimer's. And he says, well, that's different from addiction. In addiction, you can age out of it, or in a different context, you don't need the drug anymore. Think of the Vietnam examples where people coming back from Vietnam who were heroin addicted found recovery very easy because they changed context. He says that's not going to happen with a proper brain disorder, because that's not going away if you go somewhere else. You take that with you because it's in your brain, if you like. So if I'm going to say that with Wakefield that even externalist mental health conditions can be brain disorders, I need to have a response to that. Well, here's my response. If all brain disorders need to be like Alzheimer's or brain tumors, then addiction and depression cannot be brain disorders. But that's not exactly news. We already knew that most mental health conditions are like Alzheimer's and brain tumors. They're neurodegenerative conditions that are progressive and irreversible if not treated. So it seems that if we want to say, as for example, the authors of the RDoC say, that certain mental disorders are brain disorders, then it already needs to be the case that we want a notion of brain disorder that's broader than just those paradigm cases. And that's more context dependent. And that also makes allowance for brain plasticity and for the idea that brain disorders can go away again. So changes in brain function can be temporary and they can be reversible. And if we're going to talk about dysfunctional brain processes, as we do actually, even irrespective of whether we want to use the word brain disorder, then we often do that on the basis of psychological symptoms, when we say, okay, there's something happening in the mind and there's like wanting in weird situations, or what is it that, can't remember exactly, but there's the idea that you have wanting without desiring or something. I'm not going to reconstruct it now. In addiction, and that's because of certain things happen in your brain, then your line of argument is going to go from saying, well, whatever in the brain, that specific thing happening in the brain that is realized, that makes your mental, I hate this causal language when we're talking about mind and brain. So sorry for getting a bit jumbled here. So the idea is, if there's something going on in the brain, and that's always associated with a certain dysfunctional psychological process, and we have said that that psychological process is dysfunctional, then it will very often be the case that we'll say, okay, whatever's going on in the brain there, that's different from what we get in brain function or structure in the non-clinical population, is dysfunctional because of the psychological processes that it realizes, not because we could independently make out something dysfunctional about it. And then with externalism, it gets even more complicated because the dysfunctionality at the psychological level may also rely on the external context, as we've seen. But I don't see any reason to say, but I'm sure you'll disagree with me, that we can't say that the brain is behaving or dysfunctionally in these contexts, even if it's not like Alzheimer's, in the sense that it's going to keep on going and at some point you're going to die of it. On that cheerful note, I will conclude. So the examples like addiction and depression show the importance of context for the status of disorderedness. Whether we call a condition like addiction a brain disorder depends on whether we think paradigm cases of brain disorders exhaust our brain disorder repertoire. It also obviously depends on whether you want to call it a disorder in the first place. But I was just assuming that we're happy to call it a mental disorder in this context, but I realize that's controversial in its own right. And then finally, there's a number of ways, not just one, of conceptualizing mental disorders as brain disorders, which allow reversible functional and structural changes to count as disordered because of the way they are embedded into a context in Wakefield or the impairment they cause. Oh, and that's me done. Thank you for listening. I should say that as this is a slideshow and it's recorded and so on and so forth, and I'm not giving you a handout, I didn't do a bibliography at the end of works cited. But if you do want to know a bit more, or if you want the references basically for the papers that I was talking about and referring to, then send me an email and I will send them to you. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Anneli. That was super interesting. So we've got some time for questions. If any of you have a question, please, just raise a hand, use the hand raising function. If you are unable to use the hand raising function because you are a co-host or something, then just put your, let me know in the chat and I will call you. All right, so we have one from Sophia.
Yeah, so thanks for a really interesting talk. So you talked about Hannah Picard, and she said that you know, we wouldn't say that something in the brain is a dysfunction if it didn't produce adverse psychological symptoms, something. But I remember I was at a workshop in London in, I think, 2014 or something, so it was ages back now. But I remember Stephen Morse talked about something similar, and like he agreed with that, but said you should take the same position on somatic stuff. So for instance, I think it's like fairly recent research in physiology that has shown that if you take just a random sample of people who think they have like no problems with their backs and you do like x-rays on them all, you're gonna find a substantial amount of stuff that looks like there is like some injury or whatever in their spines, but they don't suffer from it, and it doesn't even seem to predict anything, like put them at greater risk of pain in the future or something. And his idea was that, you know, then you're gonna say that, okay, even if it looks weird on the x-ray, these people are not injured because they feel fine. And conversely, if you have like intense pain from your back, even if you can't find anything on x-ray, you should say like, yeah, you have a legit problem because you're in pain. And that's sort of analogous to the mental illness case. And I wonder if you had any thoughts on that, if that makes sense to you.
Yes, yeah, it does make sense to me. I remember that, I think we were at the same workshop actually.
Yeah, probably.
I remember that example. So I'm not sure I would go quite so far as he does in saying that. I would certainly say you don't have a problem if your spine shows up funny, but it's not causing you any problems. You might say it's an injury. I mean, the whole disorder vocabulary, there's so many different words, and so if you can have an injury without having a disorder, then I would kind of be happy to say that. I mean, the same thing arises quite, I mostly think about functional changes in the brain when I think about this, but you have the same thing in brain science as well. I was at a conference once and talking to a neuroscientist, and he said, well, we scanned this young woman, and we found that half the brain was missing, and we didn't know whether to tell her because she was clearly perfectly fine. But it's a very shocking thing to tell somebody. And I'm sort of a bit torn there. I'm probably not doing myself any favors by saying that, because I would certainly say that that person doesn't have a disorder, but it just seems like there's something not quite right with the brain, or at least something unusual. Yeah, but I mean, that was part of what I was trying to do when I was doing the hemophilia example, that I was trying to say, well, we have these external criteria both in somatic medicine and in psychiatry, and it's not always that disanalogous. I mean, the problem is that lots of things come together. Anyway, I think I've answered your question. Somebody else might want to.
All right, so Alexander is next.
Thanks, Anneli. Super talk as ever. Just a couple of thoughts on the Davis comparison, the externalism argument from depression versus, as it were, ordinary sadness brought about by some, yes, appropriate event, like, such as, yes, a death you bring on grief. I mean, I think there's an externalist argument to be made, but the way he made it, as it were, it feels the same from the inside, seems a bit weak. I mean, I'd be willing to make a big bet that there are brain differences, because one of the things that's peculiar about depression is that it's so unresponsive to external stimuli, and that's, I'm sure that that's a brain effect, the fact that it's self-sustaining. So the argument there is very unclear that what's going on internally is in fact identical in those two cases, and I don't think he's really made the case for that.
Nope, so the paper's short.
So moving on to the love example, again, it's sort of interesting here. I mean, that could be right, but one thing that's worth pointing out is actually what kinds of condition we are inclined to call addictions has changed over time. So once upon a time, people didn't think that gambling could be an addiction or that sex could be addictive. I mean, that was not not the term that was used, and people changed their minds, particularly as they found that in fact the brain states were similar. That was one of the things that inclined people to talk about gambling, food, and sex addiction can be addictive. And you wouldn't be at all surprised if there are some, they might want to say, well, perhaps some cases of love really are addictive. Perhaps the cases that you or count as addictions in the way that you said. But even if we decided that we're just simply not going to call the love case an addiction because we don't want to, and because the idea of disorder has this social element, doesn't mean that in the cases of addictions that they aren't, as it were, in a sense, fundamentally grounded in the brain state. It would just be that we've got this case of deciding which ones we want to call disorders and which not for social reasons, but that wouldn't stop it being the case that addiction to a drug is fundamentally a brain state, the brain problem.
Am I allowed to respond? So that's thanks. I agree with most of that, I think. And there was one bit of the talk that I haven't given because I've already taken up the time, and I cut it out before making the slides. But I think, and it goes to your last point where you said, well, maybe the brain is the same, but we don't want to call one of it that and the other one that. And I think part of what's driving these disagreements about brain disorders is this idea that you get extremely sort of high profile, if you like, in Zass's work, where the idea is if you could say it's a brain disorder, then that would be all your normative questions sorted. If you go the externalist route and say, no, the external factors matter as well, and if you have a more permissive notion of brain disorders where you can say, well, okay, it's a brain disorder because it's doing this and this in your psychology and not because your brain's falling apart or something like that, then you're not going to get around all the normative questions that you have in a mental health context because you're still going to need a criterion to say, well, when is this bad enough that I'm going to call it a disorder? And I think both the appeal and the reason, or part of the appeal, but also the reason why some people are repulsed by this idea that mental health conditions are brain disorders is because there's this, in my opinion, false hope that it would give you a clear way of sorting the disorders from the non-disorders. Now, I don't think that's a promising way to go anyway, but what it does do in a rather troubling way is put into the spotlight just how much normative work we will then have to do if you have fairly similar things going on when you're unhappily in love and when you're addicted. I mean, one thing that, last thing I'm going to say before I shut up and the next person can say something. One thing that really came home to me when I was writing the talk were all these pop songs which talk about love hurts, might as well face it, you're addicted to love. I'm going to play you a whole medley. If we go with pop music, then addiction, then love is also A, an addiction, and B, a disorder in many cases.
Great. So next person on my list is John Mason. John Mason 2.
Yes. Yeah. Hi. Thank you. Yeah. So it's quite a practical kind of question coming from, I'm a psychiatrist, psych doctor. So the practical question, especially the last part of your talk, there's sort of a bit of a hot topic about de-diagnosing as being something that needs to be, maybe taught for psychiatrists. From what you've described, could you see an argument from what you've been describing as how that might be taught to trainees, and in what circumstances there might be an argument for doing that? Obviously, you've mentioned plasticity, you've mentioned context. Therefore, there are grounds that could exist for, but I'm also thinking, what is the argument for not de-diagnosing? How can it be justified not to de-diagnose? Sometimes psychiatry is very much a historicized thing, so the history is, in a way, is a constant record that doesn't go away, but much to the much a cause of much concern for a lot of patients as well.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. That's a really important question. It's also one that needs a lot of unpacking, because you have two problems into one, right? So you've got the anti-diagnosis movement, which is also it's very strongly against certain strands in biological psychiatry, but it's also against sort of having this entity called schizophrenia, or this entity called depression. So the worry isn't just about the brain bit of it. The worry is more generally about giving you that label that is considered by many to be stigmatizing. So my thinking on this is twofold. I'm not anti-diagnosis, but I'm also not a practitioner. But I do, I mean, as we all do, and especially if you work in this area, you get confronted with diagnosis and what it does with people more than you might otherwise. And I think one thing you need to do is get people to think through what, for example, finding something different in the brain really shows you and what it doesn't show you. And when it comes to these things like externalism and social context and so on and so forth, and the importance of social context also for causing certain kinds of psychological suffering, that you highlight all of this. And you can do that whether you call it depression or whether you don't call it depression. You can get all of the important contributing factors on the line, irrespective of the label. And then I think my temptation, and that's might be a losing battle, but I would want to change the labels rather than getting rid of them, because in many cases labels can be very useful in helping you make sense of your condition and deal with it, and knowing what certain susceptibilities are and so on and so forth. So for example, and this is obviously going to have to be anonymized, a friend who suffers from depression was telling me, well, finding out that memory problems are commonly associated with depression has been a real relief for him. I should anonymize even more and say for them, but it's too late now, because they didn't know that before, and and it helps to put things into context. So yeah, I think it's a difficult topic, and I think lots of things are going wrong, but I haven't given up hope that we can update the labels rather than giving them up altogether, I suppose, is what I'd like to say.
Is there time just to come back for half a second? Just to say, I guess the one point I was trying to draw out was that could you see the possibility that a diagnosis no longer retains its validity, say biologically, contextually, practically, functionally, and if that's the case, the recovery is objectively stated in whatever arguments put, then how can that be put into practice, that de-prescribing, say, yeah, okay, the diagnosis we can accept is useful for when it serves its accurate purposes, but then later on, the problem, say, is in health records, often diagnosis, it becomes almost like a permanent thing. It can't be undone, say.
Okay, so that's a policy problem, which
and also maybe a philosophical problem in terms of if we say it's biological, genetic even, then etc.
Yes, but I think that's part of the problem, and that's where I would want to get back to the delabeling, that you get problem with the brain, genetic, biological, and they all get lumped together. There's some very good empirical work on how people go straight from saying it's a brain disorder to then thinking it's genetic, it can't change, and so on and so forth. And then if we do believe in plasticity, then we're just going to have to say, well, the brain can change as well. I mean, I suppose the worst case scenario, and I have been thinking about this quite a bit because the last bit of my book is about this problem of brain disorder labels and stigma. Like, I don't know if you said, so I think in theory we should be able to get past this, but in practice we might not be able to. And if we can't just get people to think about these things in a more complex way, and to change their, because our understanding of the brain has evolved a lot over the last 30 years, and especially when it comes to plasticity and possible change. If at some point we say, well, the brain disorder label does no harm, then good, then maybe we would have to give it up. But well, I still hope that that's not going to be necessary. And if so, that would be a pragmatic step rather than a theoretically motivated one, if you like.
Okay, so the next person on my list is Marion Godman.
Ooh, Marion!
Hi, Anneli. Great to be able to join. So, yes, it's sort of related to the point that Alexander picked up. So, I mean, one thing, and I think this is maybe just something you agree with, but I just am curious to hear what you have to say. So, one thing that I think is interesting about the addiction case, and and how we have discovered that similar kind of pathways, neural pathways, underlie gambling addictions that he brought up and falling in love, is that we seem to learn something from doing neuroscience, right? So if it was only for sorting out our intuitions about what disorders and are not disorders, then I mean, there'd be a question of what the brain is like. Why do we need the brain? But it seems like we want to learn something from this kind of research, and then we have these options about what to do once we face these kind of findings. And it seems like one thing that makes us want to think that gambling is now an addiction, and in the similar way as a drug addiction, is that we want to treat it, right? And the evidence for why to treat it is, I guess, externalist, right? That it's really disruptive for the people involved. But in the case of falling in love, or that's typically not something we want to treat. So is that kind of consideration about what we want to treat or not playing a role, do you think, in this? And I mean, because I think maybe some externalists have this thought that what they really want to push is the important thing about the environment and or people's psychological strategies that should be doing work on how we treat things, whereas the nasty brain disorder people are all going for the pharmaceutical medical solutions. So that wasn't a very clear question, but yeah, a few different thoughts.
So I don't know what your question was. I can either respond to some things that are in the air, or you can try again. What would you prefer?
No, just respond with with your thoughts. Yeah.
Okay, I'll give you. So I agree that part of the reason why this brain research is interesting because it tells us more about what's going on. I probably don't agree that we call something a disorder because we want to treat it. I mean, I agree with that as a sociological fact, but not as a principled way of making a decision. Now, what other questions were there? Oh, yes. So let me just say something again about process addictions, because I didn't mention them in the talk, but they've clearly come up as a sort of intermediate between being in love and being an alcoholic. Because some people think there aren't any process addictions like sex addiction or gambling addiction, and other people think that there are, and they draw on the brain findings as one of the ways of supporting that. Now, I haven't thought about whether I believe in process addictions or not, but I'm inclined to say yes, because it seems to me like the dysfunctional wanting and doing it in a way that is harmful for your life is quite similar to what we get in substance addiction. And I think we get okay, now this is me just shooting from the hip, and I don't want to be cited on it, but I think one thing that's different about being in love is either you sort of get the girl or the guy, and then after a while you settle down and the hormones aren't quite what they were, and just deep attachment and so on and so forth, but you don't get this extremely strong desiring. Or it doesn't go well, then you go through a phase of withdrawal, which is just as bad as what you might get with gambling, but it sort of takes care of itself unless there's some major catastrophe, because unlike the gambling, the object of your desire isn't available. So at some point you get over it. So I think that's one of the reasons, just in the way things normally run, even though there's just as much dysfunctional wanting going on in certain cases of being unhappily in love, you don't have certain certain structural elements that reinforce the addiction. Because there's only so much often you can call your ex-lover at 2 a.m. before they don't pick up the phone and block you and so on and so forth. Anyway, that's my very unconsidered thoughts on that.
All right, so Scott Waterman.
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks very much for a wonderful presentation. I guess first I just have a comment, and then I have a question. The comment is that it's long seemed really odd that it's so commonly assumed that in order for something to qualify as a brain disorder, it needs to be irreversible and somehow context independent. that's really a caricature of the rest of medicine. There's no other specialty that sees things that way in its own realm. And even when you brought up the conflation of biological with genetic, where the latter is assumed to be context independent, that doesn't even hold. If you know about the condition, for example, of phenylketonuria, which is a straightforwardly inherited single gene defect, when those children are put on a low phenylalanine diet, they're fine. It's not that the mutation goes away, it's that the manifestations of the condition go away, and thus it doesn't make any sense to call them disordered. But my question relates to some things that have sort of come up around the edges, and I just want to see if you want to say something explicit about it, and that is that at least in psychiatric circles, and certainly in the critical psychiatry circles, the question of brain disorder status is completely wrapped up in what people see as the stakes or the consequences of whether or not to consider this or that to be a brain disorder. And I'm wondering, obviously for somebody who's very interested in this topic, it can't be that you don't see the stakes that are involved. And I'm just wondering what you see as the stakes involved, and motivates you to look into this as deeply as you obviously have.
Yes. Okay. So this goes back to the question. I can't remember the name, but somebody earlier also asked a similar question about not similar, but also about the practical consequences of calling something a disorder or a brain disorder. I think that the stakes are very high, but I also think the stakes are very confused in the debate, which is why I'm so interested in it. So here's how I came to this bit of autobiography in the first place, is I was working, and I still work on moral responsibility, and I was interested in these movements that you often get where somebody goes straight from saying, oh, there's something different or wrong in the brain, so that person cannot be responsible. And I think that's wrong in most cases, but I'm not going to give you the argument for that now because we're over time already. So I think in terms of using it as a legal excuse, conversely using it as an excuse to downplay somebody's agency and downplay somebody's ability to think, I think those are huge practical issues. And one thing that I would like to do is to try and get people to move in a direction why they don't just jump from there's something wrong in the brain or something dysfunctional in the brain to thinking, oh, so that means they can't be responsible, or oh, that means they cannot think anymore. I mean, that's just not the conclusions we should draw, and that's not the conclusions we're justified in drawing. The thing that worries me a bit is that I've been working on this for quite a while now, and I'm still finding a lot of things that puzzle me. So I don't know whether as a sort of public information project, if you like, how quickly I would get anywhere is a completely different question. Because showing that something doesn't follow isn't the same as persuading everybody that they shouldn't follow, if you like.
All right, so we have 2 more questions. So are you okay to hang on for just a bit longer, Anneli? Okay, yes. Great. So next person is Sadyad Riyahi.
Hello. Hi, thank you for your talk. I really enjoyed it. So I have, I try to be as clear as I can. So I think one thing that crossed my mind is it's sometimes really hard to draw a line between the externalist and internalist. And for example, DSM-5 or its previous predecessors, they had problem, for example, in making a diagnosis, for example, in depression, so because it's a bunch of symptoms that you have to have for a certain time, and they don't necessarily point out to the pathology in the brain. And also, while it seems that increasing the overall level of serotonin in the brain can help with the symptom, but as you pointed out, there must be something outside that's causing it. And if you can do a root cause analysis, that might be more helpful in treating that. But at the same time, the new therapeutic agents that being now, I mean, they're not new, but like psychedelics that are being used now and being experimented on depression, end of life care, and even on smoking addiction, while they say that the effect of these agents are more pronounced when you have those, let's say, mystical experience, but still they cause the downstream of, neurophysiological changes. So I don't know, I wanted to know your thoughts about these.
Okay. I don't know about the specific experiments you're talking about with the psychedelic drugs. Was it that?
Yes.
So I agree with your first point that sometimes it's hard to, make a clear distinction between internalism and externalism. I mean, maybe one thing that you're getting at, if I'm understanding it correctly, that I've sort of skirted over in this talk because it's relevant, but it's also sort of slightly orthogonal to what I'm talking about is sort of when you're looking at causes for certain conditions, that you've got like a multifactorial, you've got tons of things going on. So you've got like environmental one, you do have some genetic predispositions sometimes, and you might have taken a lot of marijuana in your youth, and that might have made a difference as well. So, and then there's also the whole array of different ways of helping people who are suffering from mental distress, which also you have the environment, you have certain drugs you can take, you have certain therapies you can take. And sometimes people say, well, given that it's so multifactorial, you shouldn't call it brain disorder because that makes it seem like that's the only thing that's important. But I wouldn't say that follows, because once again, to draw the parallel to somatic disorders, there you can also have a lot of causes like stress, for example, which aren't, at least not described as purely somatic, and which depend on your social environment and so on and so forth. So, so you have that, and it makes it more complicated. But I don't think it affects the question whether we can say that certain processes going on in the brain are dysfunctional. Even though it complicates. So I don't know whether that answers your question, but that's some thoughts in response to your question, maybe the best way to say it.
All right, great. So our YSF tab.
Right, thank you. Very thought-provoking talk. I have two comments / questions. The first is, I think, even from your talk, as you talk about internalism, externalism, I see much reason to be dissatisfied with this distinction in the first place. It seems to create a sort of sharp artificial polarity. And in fact, if you look at the recent work in an active psychiatry perspective and 3E, 4E perspectives, like for example, in active psychiatry would argue that the central unit of analysis should be the organism in interaction with her environment. And if you take that perspective where your central unit of analysis is the organism environment interaction, then the idea that we could sort of like split it into internalism, externalism doesn't seem to make sense. So, I would see sort of like the main conclusion that I sort of like seem to derive from the discussion is that we should be dissatisfied with this dichotomy and maybe seek to overcome it rather than continue to play within its roles. My second thing is, second sort of like common question is that, why are we conceptualizing internalism in such heavily biological terms? I mean, like from my perspective, we could come up with a version of internalism that focuses on psychological states and may completely be agnostic to biological states at all. I mean, if we talk about something like Donald Davidson's supervenience, then we can simply talk about unique psychological states and states of mind, and be completely disregard as to like whether those psychological states are tied into any specific or any unique biological signatures or not. So why are we tying internalism so heavily to biology when that is not necessarily so, philosophically speaking?
Okay, good. Those are two pretty heavy-hitting questions right at the end, but I can say something about both of them. So the first one, you say, well, really what we should be doing is 4E, and then the whole distinction between internalism and externalism goes away. I think the reason why I haven't done it like that was that traditionally 4E is just understood as externalism in the philosophy of mind, broadly speaking. And so as at least I was just going to talk German to you. This is how tired I'm getting. At least in the Davis paper, it's sort of constructed as a contrast, and it's very much sort of starting from the content internalism, extended mind, where you still very much have this internalism, externalism divide. And I do think that while that's wrong, while we shouldn't think of brain disorders in the sort of cancer, everything is in the mind, and I'm sure somebody will tell me that cancer is not like that either in a minute, but it's sort of the way the debate came about. So we're starting where people left us, if you like. So that explains why I talked about it like that. And I perfectly agree with you that if we're going to talk about internalism, this is about your second question, then you could just do psychological internalism. And in fact, back when I was doing my PhD, I was very interested in content internalism and found it very intuitive. And I always looked at that as a psychological theory rather than going all the way down to the brain. So yes, you can do that. I think the reason that it hasn't been done like that, or at least sometimes hasn't been done like that, is because there was this idea that we can sort of use the externalist hypothesis to get rid of, in one fell swoop, of certain types of biological psychiatry that we don't like. So that might have been sort of a dialectical move of putting that as your internalist target, because then you get a 2-for-1. You can also get rid of biological psychiatry. But that might be uncharitable towards the people who've written that. So there's one explanation, not the most charitable one, but the one I can think about after talking for 1.5 hours on difficult topics.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so a final question can go to Linda Gask, if we can keep it relatively short and sweet. Sorry, Linda, you're going to have to unmute yourself.
Yeah. I was wanting to, I guess, add a further layer of complexity and wonder what your thoughts were. But you're starting with the idea based on kind of DSM that we actually know that there is something called addiction, and we actually know that there is a single thing called depression. And I guess my question would be, what if there are many different kinds of depression that all have different balance in terms of internalism and externalism? And similarly with the concept of addiction, that are we not missing a whole level of complexity here?
Yes, very good point. It's even more complicated than I've told you. So there's obviously problems and discussions about diagnostic categories. And in as far as they are problematic, that then will infect the rest of the discussion. But one interesting thing is that if you think of the RDoc, whether you like it or not, we're not going to worry about whether we like the RDoc at this point. But one interesting thing about that is that there the idea is we don't have the right diagnoses. So what we need to do is drill down on specific areas of functioning and look at them at the brain level and at the mental level and at the social level and so on and so forth. And there the idea is, well, part of the reason we haven't found anything particularly impressive or maybe better to say decisive in the brain is because we haven't been looking in the right place. Yeah, I think that's a worry, and that's a worry that interacts with the other worries. But you could probably think through the whole thing that we've thought through today in sort of other categories. But these are the ones we've got at the moment, so that's the ones we've been using. But thank you.
I just wanted to add another dimension, just to make it more complicated.
Yes, no, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. So thank you so much, Anneli. I'm going to unmute you all so you can join me in thanking her. Thanks, Anneli. That was a really great talk. And yeah, I hope to see many of you at our events in the future as well. If you're ever wondering what we're up to, just go to our website and check it out.
Thank you. I'm going to mute myself now. But thanks so much for coming and listening and having great questions and introducing more complexity, which I was partially aware of, but it's still daunting. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And where is the recording available? I'm sorry.
Right, so that's going to be available on our website as well, but I'll send around an email to that attendee list so you all know where it's going to be at.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye, Anneli. See you soon.
Well, you're quite able to think it through. Do you think you're incapable of thinking it through? It's not hard, is it?
Hey, where do I find the chats addressed to me?
Oh, I don't know.
Because I got a few popping up, but I had to ignore them because I was.
Oh yeah. So I mean, have you clicked the chat thing? Do you see the chat?
Yes. Yes. Okay. Thanks. I've got it.
Okay. Awesome. Thank you so much, by the way, Anneli. That was super interesting and cool.
Thank you. Yes, it was hard work, but I enjoyed it.
yeah. They're a bit stressful, these things. Hey, Alexander, if I click stop on the recording now, where does that recording sort of?
It probably end up in the cloud.
Okay.
Right. But it might be on your on your computer. But so when you log in next time, it should tell you your recordings.
Yeah. All right. Cool. Great. I'm clicking that then.